My brother's roar tore through the house like a thunderclap, and for an instant, it felt like the walls themselves trembled at his rage. He stood there, finger jabbing at my chest, calling me a leech and a pathetic freeloader, his voice choked with contempt. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might collapse. I wanted to scream back, to demand he see the truth, that I was the one secretly propping up our parents' finances, that his scorn was built on ignorance. But I couldn't form words under the weight of his accusations. Before I knew it, he'd thrust an ultimatum at me: pack my things and get out. I never imagined my older brother, Derek, would hate me enough to hurl such cruel words. Growing up, we weren't exactly best friends. We bickered over toys, chores, typical sibling rivalries, but I always believed we shared a bond deeper than the friction. Our parents, Karen and Robert, did their best to raise us in a stable, middle-class environment. Derek, 4 years my senior, excelled at sports, thrived in social circles, and rarely gave me the time of day. Yet I idolized him in my quiet ways, copying his style and trying to keep up with his jokes. In college, Derek majored in business but never seemed to find stable ground after graduating. He drifted between jobs, couch-surfed with friends, and often blamed the economy for his failures. Meanwhile, I discovered a knack for digital marketing, landing a remote gig that paid decently. As the years progressed, I inched closer to financial independence. Derek, conversely, sank deeper into frustration, returning home to live under our parents' roof more than once. I never judged him outwardly. Life can be harsh. However, I noticed how his pride bristled whenever I mentioned my small accomplishments. Must be nice, he'd say, tone thick with sarcasm. About 2 years ago, our father's health began to decline. Subtle changes at first: frequent fatigue, loss of appetite. Then the diagnosis arrived: a chronic cardiac condition requiring costly medication and regular checkups. I watched my parents' stress balloon as medical bills piled up. They prided themselves on self-reliance, so they didn't ask for help. But I saw the cracks forming. They started rationing groceries, skipping vacations. My mother tried to work extra shifts at a local supermarket, though she was well past retirement age. My father insisted they'd manage, but I wasn't convinced. At that point, I'd built up a decent savings from my remote job and side hustles. Quietly, I resolved to help. I approached Dad with an offer to contribute monthly to their bills. He refused at first, old-school pride flaring. It took weeks of gentle persuasion, but eventually he accepted on the condition that nobody else, especially not Derek, should know. He's sensitive about money, Dad explained. I don't want him feeling overshadowed. So it became our secret arrangement. Each month, I'd deposit a chunk of money into their account. Enough to cover Dad's medication, doctor's visits, maybe some household expenses. My father softened, eyes filled with gratitude. We sealed the promise with a handshake that reminded me of simpler times. Meanwhile, Derek occasionally asked how our parents managed to stay afloat, and they'd wave him off, crediting some savings we found. He never questioned it deeply. If anything, he resented that our folks refused to bail him out of his own debts. They must have a hidden stash, he'd grumble, not realizing I was that stash. 3. Time passed. Dad stabilized, though he needed ongoing care. My monthly contributions grew slightly as costs rose. I lived in a tiny studio near the city, saving where I could. I rarely bought new clothes, avoided pricey outings. Every penny not used for rent or food funneled back home. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right. I loved them. And though the secrecy weighed on me, I respected Dad's wish not to stir Derek's pride. Then last month, a perfect storm hit. Derek lost yet another job, fired for missing deadlines, and retreated, sullen, to our parents' place. He claimed it was temporary, that he had a big opportunity lined up. Days stretched into weeks, and soon he was ordering takeout on their dime, lounging in front of the TV. Tension simmered. Mom whispered to me on the phone, "He's all moody, complaining about no support. Meanwhile, we can hardly cover groceries." I gritted my teeth, continuing my silent support. But I suspected something would snap soon. For one evening, out of the blue, Derek decided to rummage through some mail. He discovered a bank statement referencing suspicious deposits in my parents' account. He confronted them, demanding to know where the money was coming from. Panicked, Dad tried to shrug it off, saying they'd worked out a deal with an old friend. Derek's temper flared. He insisted they must have secret finances they were withholding from him, their struggling son, which sparked a massive argument. Furious, he concluded that if there was money to spare, it should be used to pay off his credit card bills or invest in his next business scheme. My parents refused, telling him that their finances were not his to control. The tension erupted into a shouting match that left Dad exhausted, clutching his chest, and Derek stormed out, swearing he'd find the truth. The next day I arrived for my usual weekend visit, sensing an undercurrent of hostility in the air. Derek glared from across the kitchen, shooting me daggers. "So," he said, "did you know about this mystery money?" My heart raced. I feigned ignorance. "Mystery money? No clue." He grunted, eyes narrowing. "Right?" The rest of the day was stilted, overshadowed by Derek's suspicion. That night as I was leaving, my father grabbed my arm softly, asking me not to reveal the truth. "He'll never understand," Dad whispered. "He'll just get angry." I nodded, though I felt dread pooling in my gut. Little did I know Derek was already brewing a conspiracy theory. Over the following week, he pored over bank statements, asked neighbors intrusive questions. He discovered my frequent visits to the local branch. From there, it wasn't hard to piece together that I was depositing funds. Furious, he confronted Dad again, demanding an explanation. Dad tried to stand firm, saying it was my personal choice to help, but Derek twisted it around, claiming I was meddling in their affairs, buying favor. According to Mom, he accused me of playing savior to make him look bad, labeling me a leech, implying I was controlling them financially for some twisted sense of power. The irony was stunning but also heartbreaking. My father tried to correct him, but Derek raged, believing some delusion that I was draining their resources or manipulating them. At that point, I decided enough was enough. I planned to come clean, sit Derek down, show him the receipts of how I was giving money, not taking it. Maybe it'd humble him or force an understanding. But I never got the chance. Because the next weekend I showed up at the front door, only to have Derek greet me with a sneer. "Don't bother coming in," he spat, arms blocking the entrance. "We know you've been siphoning from Dad. You're out permanently." My mother stood behind him, looking anxious, and Dad was too frail to protest. My heart pounded as I stammered, "What are you talking about? I'm not siphoning anything." He roared that I was in Leech, that I'd convinced our parents to let me funnel money in and out, skimming off the top. The bizarre logic made no sense, but his rage was unstoppable. Stunned, tears burning my eyes, I tried to get past him, but he shoved me back. "Get off this property," he yelled. My mother whispered timidly, "Maybe let them explain," but Derek silenced her with a glare. And my father, heartbreakingly, remained silent, perhaps out of fear or confusion. So I left, chest tight, not wanting to cause a scene that might jeopardize Dad's health. Derek slammed the door behind me. Just like that, I was banished from my childhood home. And in his twisted perspective, I was the villain. 6. Driving back to my apartment, I could barely see through the tears. My mind churned with the injustice. All this time, I'd sacrificed to support them, and now Derek had stolen any chance for me to show Dad how much I cared. The fear that my father would pass away believing these lies clawed at my heart. Over the next few days I tried calling, texting. No reply. Mom's phone was answered once by Derek, who hissed that I was dead to them. I felt powerless, not wanting to escalate stress for Dad's sake. But I refused to accept this narrative. Then, out of nowhere, my bank flagged suspicious activity on my personal savings. A clerk called, asking if I'd authorized a large transfer. My stomach dropped. "No," I said. "Who is it to?" They mentioned a partial name that sounded like my brother. My pulse skyrocketed. Could Derek be so audacious as to hack into my account, or coerce Dad to do it? Furious, I authorized the bank to freeze any movement, pending an investigation. 7. Days later, the bank discovered that someone had tried to deposit a check from my father's account, presumably Derek's doing, into my personal account, then withdraw those funds in a new location. The arrangement made little sense unless Derek was trying to stage some proof that I was leeching or to funnel money in a manipulative way. The bank official was baffled, calling it a bizarre attempt at either framing me or stealing from me. They suggested I file a police report. That's how I ended up sitting in a cramped station, speaking to an officer who looked tired of family drama. I explained Derek's false accusations, the monthly support I gave to Dad, and now this strange check incident. The officer listened, nodding, then said, "It might be your brother is trying to show on paper that you're siphoning money from your father, so he can claim you're a financial abuser." My jaw dropped. Financial abuser? Could that be Derek's angle? So he'd frame me as stealing from Dad, justify kicking me out, maybe even attempt to press charges? The officer shook his head, remarking how messed up families can get over money. I left the station in a fog. The next day I called Dad's phone repeatedly, only to have it ring unanswered. I felt an ache in my chest, wondering if he was okay. Finally, on the third call, my mother picked up, whispering, "He's not well. Derek forbade us from speaking to you." My anger flared, but I kept calm, pleading for her to let me talk to Dad. She claimed Dad was too weak, that Derek oversaw everything, saying I was dangerous. She sounded trapped, apologizing over and over. My stomach churned with helpless fury. At that point, I decided to hire a lawyer. Enough was enough. I needed an order allowing me to see my father, or at least ensure no one else was exploiting him. The lawyer, Ms. Randall, specialized in elder law. She told me that if Derek was controlling Dad's finances, we might investigate if Dad was mentally coerced. She also recommended we produce evidence of my monthly deposits. With that, we could dispel Derek's Leech lie. I felt a surge of hope. The bank records were clear as day. Every month I'd deposit a chunk labeled Dad's care. Ms. Randall believed it might be enough to get a protective order for Dad, or at least a hearing. Meanwhile, I discovered from a mutual friend that Derek had boasted about exposing me, telling neighbors I was caught stealing from Dad. My blood boiled. The friend said Dad looked thinner, rarely left the house, and Derek was always looming around. My mother seemed constantly anxious. So with Ms. Randall's guidance, we filed for a court hearing to address potential elder abuse. My father was effectively isolated, and we suspected financial or emotional manipulation by Derek. We also aimed to produce proof of my consistent financial contributions, clearing my name. 9. The hearing was scheduled within 2 weeks. I arrived at the courthouse trembling. Derek showed up, arms crossed, shooting me a vicious look. My mother trailed behind him, eyes downcast. Dad wasn't present, presumably too ill to attend. Ms. Randall presented the bank statements showing tens of thousands in deposits from my account to Dad's over the past year. The judge, a stern woman with a no-nonsense vibe, scrutinized them carefully. Then Ms. Randall explained how Derek had forcibly removed me from the home, alleging I was in Leech, yet the record suggested the opposite. I was supporting them. When Derek took the stand, he rambled about how he discovered secret money, that I was hoarding it or funneling it illegally. The judge pressed him for evidence. He had none, just hearsay and claims that I manipulated Dad into letting me handle finances. The judge looked unimpressed. Next, my mother was called to testify. She seemed torn, glancing at Derek before sighing, "I can't lie. My child here has been giving us money. She's not the thief. Derek is mistaken." The relief that washed over me was indescribable. She might have cowered before Derek at home, but under oath she told the truth. The judge asked why my father wasn't present. Mom explained his failing health. Then Ms. Randall insisted on a medical evaluation to see if Dad was being properly cared for. The judge concluded that Derek's allegations held no water, that the record showed I was no financial abuser. Instead, it appeared Derek had prevented me from seeing Dad, possibly harming Dad's well-being. She ordered a welfare check on Dad and granted me the right to visit him at once. Derek fumed, storming out of the courtroom. I sat there, tears in my eyes, feeling a weight lift from my chest. My name was cleared. More importantly, I could see Dad again. With the court order in hand, a social worker and I headed to the family home. Derek tried to bar us at the door, but the social worker flashed the official paperwork, warning him of legal consequences if he obstructed. He backed off grudgingly, muttering curses under his breath. My mother greeted me with teary hugs, apologizing for not intervening sooner. Then we found Dad in the living room, slouched in an armchair, looking frail. My heart ached at the sight. His eyes lit up when he saw me, though confusion flitted across his face. "They said you stole from me," he murmured. But I knew that wasn't right. I felt so powerless. The tears came then, and I knelt beside him, gently reassuring him it was all a lie. The social worker spoke with Dad privately, assessing his mental and physical state. Meanwhile, I confronted Derek in the hallway. "You knew I wasn't stealing," I hissed. "I've been paying for Dad's bills. Why do this?" He glared, bitterness etched in his features. "You made me look incompetent," he spat. "Always swooping in, paying for everything, acting like the hero. I was sick of it. I needed them to see you weren't so perfect." My jaw dropped at the warped logic. "So you lied, you humiliated me, you isolated Dad, just to feed your ego?" He had no response, just a sullen silence. 11. Ultimately, the social worker reported that Dad was not receiving adequate care under Derek's watch. He missed doctor appointments, wasn't taking meds regularly. The court stepped in, granting me guardianship to handle Dad's healthcare decisions. Derek was effectively barred from interfering unless supervised. My father, relieved, insisted he wanted me to help him anyway. Over the following weeks, I arranged for Dad to move into my small apartment, setting up a spare room so I could monitor his medication and ensure he saw his doctors. My mother, feeling torn, decided to move with him. Derek was left alone in that house, seething. At first, I worried we'd have no space, but we managed. Dad's health improved under consistent care. I paid for a visiting nurse with my savings, though Dad insisted on eventually reimbursing me from his retirement. Meanwhile, the drama with Derek quieted. He had no legal footing to challenge the guardianship, and the community started to see him as the manipulator. Some offered me sympathy, marveling at how I withstood such betrayal. It wasn't easy. My relationship with Derek was in ruins, likely beyond repair. Still, I found solace in caring for Dad, fulfilling the vow I made when I first started sending money. Well, ironically, Derek tried one last gambit, spinning a sob story that he was actually the victim, that I forcibly took Dad away and cut him off. But the truth was out. Mom confirmed that Derek was the one who orchestrated my eviction with false accusations, that he neglected Dad's medical needs. People saw through his lies. He ended up moving to another town eventually, presumably to find a fresh start among folks who didn't know his background. I heard rumors he resented me fiercely, but I'd learned not to carry that weight. The sense of heartbreak lingered, but time dulled the sting. In the months that followed, Dad and I rebuilt our connection. He confided how powerless he felt under Derek's intimidation. I wanted to speak up, he told me, but I was scared. My health was declining and your mother was frightened. Derek's anger seemed unstoppable. The sadness in his voice cut deep. I assured him I understood. I also told him about my monthly deposits from way back, how I truly wanted to keep him safe. He patted my hand gently, whispering, "You always were the strong one." 13. Eventually, Dad's health stabilized enough that we considered moving to a more comfortable home. He joked about wanting a garden to tinker with. I used what remained of my savings and some of his funds to purchase a small house on the outskirts of the city, with a modest yard and accessible features for Dad's condition. My mother joined us, apologizing again for her inaction. I tried to let go of resentment. She was stuck in a complicated dynamic, and fear can silence people. Slowly we found a quiet routine. I continued working remotely. Dad spent his days puttering around the backyard, and Mom tried new recipes, showing glimmers of joy I hadn't seen in years. As for the rest of the extended family, some were outraged at Derek's behavior, cutting ties with him. A few tried to mediate, but I refused to rehash the trauma. My father was content in his final years, and that was what mattered. We'd weathered the storm. The one heartbreak that lingered was losing a brother. But I comforted myself with the knowledge that I had done my best, that Derek's bitterness was his own burden to bear. 14. Sometimes in quiet moments I reflect on that day Derek called me a leech, hurling me out of the family home. If only he had known the truth from the start, that I was the one quietly supporting everything, not draining it. Perhaps it might have changed his perspective. But maybe not. He harbored resentment too deep for logic. The phrase still echoes in my mind at times, stirring a mix of hurt and irony. Being labeled a parasite while I was the main financial lifeline was a bitter pill. But if not for that injustice, I might never have taken decisive steps, revealing how Dad was neglected and asserting guardianship to protect him. In a strange way, Derek's cruelty spurred me to stand up for myself and for Dad. It forged a resilience I didn't know I possessed. My father, in his final years, enjoyed a measure of peace, free from Derek's manipulations. I remain grateful for that. My mother, too, seemed to find a new gentleness, acknowledging how deeply her passivity hurt me. Over time we rebuilt trust. I learned that sometimes, to preserve the well-being of those you love, you must confront the ones who cause harm, even if they share your blood. 15. Years have drifted by. Dad eventually passed away, but not before I got to hold him in a comfortable home, telling him I loved him with no secrets or shame. He left me a letter before he died, thanking me for all I did, apologizing for Derek's betrayal. He wrote, "You proved that true love is quiet, unwavering care." I still tear up reading those words, yet I also smile, recalling how he tried to shield me from family drama, never guessing it would reach such extremes. I rarely hear about Derek these days. Rumor has it he's drifting again, bouncing from one plan to another, complaining about life's unfairness. I wish him no harm, but I also can't forget how he turned on me, branding me a leech. If he ever seeks reconciliation, maybe we'll talk. But it'll require honesty and remorse on his part. Meanwhile, I live without regrets, comforted by the knowledge that Dad knew the truth and we spent his final months in harmony. Sometimes, acquaintances or neighbors bring up the incident, recalling how scandalous it was that a brother exiled his sibling from their parents' home. They ask if I resent him. The answer is complicated. Yes, I resent the cruelty, the lies, the heartbreak. But I also see it as a painful stepping stone that led me to protect Dad and discover my own strength. The ordeal proved that even the darkest betrayals can spark necessary change. Out of heartbreak came healing. Now, each morning in my modest house, I glance at the framed photo of my father in the living room. His gentle smile reminds me of everything we overcame. I've reconnected with a sense of purpose, helping elderly neighbors with errands or finances, volunteering at a local community center. In memory of Dad, I strive to be a quiet pillar of support for those in need, refusing to let bitterness define me. 16. In the end, the story of how my brother called me a leech and kicked me out of our parents' home is one of heartbreak and redemption. The heartbreak lies in realizing how twisted jealousy and misunderstanding can poison sibling bonds. The redemption surfaces in how I reclaimed my dignity, unveiled the truth, and safeguarded my father's well-being. While Derek's lie momentarily cast me as the villain, I emerged with clarity. I was no parasite. I was the caretaker, the one bridging the gaps Dad needed filled. If I could speak to Derek now, I'd say, I forgive you for your anger but not your cruelty. You robbed me of a brother I once admired. Yet in doing so, you forced me to stand tall in the face of slander. And for that, ironically, I found strength. We might never mend the rift fully, but I hold no illusions. Some cracks remain. Regardless, my father's legacy endures in my heart, a testament to resilience and quiet love. I remain confident that if he could see the aftermath, he'd be proud I upheld the values he taught me: compassion, perseverance, and unwavering loyalty, even when overshadowed by betrayal. So the next time someone calls me a leech, I'll remember Derek's misguided fury, and how it crumbled under the weight of truth. I'll remember how, in the face of slander, I proved that real care cannot be disguised or erased. And I'll hold my head high, continuing forward with the knowledge that adversity sometimes yields the sweetest revelations about who we truly are and what we truly stand for.